Hi everyone, it's Stephanie with Dear Americana, your program about womanhood and American cultures. Today we're doing an episode on Gallerinas, most notably known in Charlotte York from Sex and the City, and most recently in Marnie Michaels, I guess, from Girls, and a bunch of other iterations, including Alexandra Leclerc, the newly minted wife of F1 driver Charles Leclerc. Anyways, I hope everyone is well. I am just coming off a collab episode that I did with my favorite podcast, Stargirl, about Stevie Nicks. And in the episode, I kind of bring this analysis, I guess, of the 1970s California music scene landscape. So if you're interested in that, like, definitely check it out. And yeah, for anyone new here, kind of to explain Dear Americana, the program kind of takes a moment in American history, whether it's the Oregon Trail or the hippie counterculture, and does a cultural analysis on the version of womanhood it produced. So a little bit different than, the history of women in the movement, more so about like what kind of femininity was created or valued in that moment, right? And I think that says a lot, both about like femininity, American femininity, etc., but also about the historical moment itself. Anyways, yeah, this is my first video rendition, but there are also podcast episodes that I've done about hippie women, pachucas, aka like Chicanas in World War II Los Angeles, and AKAs, the first Black American sorority. Um, and if you're curious about those, go over to wherever you listen to your podcast, or if you want to listen to this on audio, you can go there too. But yeah, Gallerinas. I'm so excited for this because I feel like it's pretty relevant and compelling to a lot of girls today. So, like I was saying, Gallerinas kind of is most notably known through the character of Charlotte York. And at their peak, they were emblems of this turn of the century kind of moment in contemporary art when the art market and the market in general was booming. So, how do we define a gallerina? A gallerina, or maybe a gallery girl, as they might be known, was usually a junior female employee of a gallery, likely in New York City. She was mostly in generalist or administrative roles, usually as like a receptionist or an assistant. And usually she was fresh out of undergrad with a degree in art history or comparative literature from a liberal arts college. And a common ambition amongst these women would be to become an art dealer, maybe a curator of a gallery, but usually not an artist herself. So the idea of the gallerina role would be an apprenticeship of sorts, kind of to work your way up and become part of this social scene. And the specific term gallerina is thought to be coined in 2007 in this book, Lulu Meets God and Doubts Him. The book is basically about like gallery girls running around New York City in the early 2000s. But the idea of this client facing, young, educated gallery girl was coherent since even the early 1990s. Bunch of terms floating around here. There's gallery girl, there's Gagosian girl, which refers to like the large amount of young women big art dealer Larry Gagosian would employ. We'll get into that later. But the underlying concept of the term gallerina, I would say, is that it's a bit diminutive. It's like a small thing, I guess I would say, in the term like Ina. Um, and it's kind of the vibe I get is like it's as if like the job is a pretense for the aesthetic work that a gallerina might be doing. Um, so a gallerina's primary function, secondary to her own ambitions or her own goals, was about perception, the perception of the gallery. Um, the name gallerina kind of communicates a lot about this. Gallerina's job is defined by her appearance and her demeanor. Like a ballerina, she should be like slender, graceful, even a little bit aloof, and she should also evoke some kind of classical training. That's where the degree comes in. And she should be dressed fashionably but tastefully, and she's there mostly to lend the gallery some cachet, like this elusive and evocative it factor. So, New York Times piece on gallerinas calls them the gatekeepers to the art world. This piece is from the 2000s, and kind of describes a gallerina as someone who manages access to things like price lists or a certain painting's availability. So exclusivity is the underlying current here, but also, like, even more importantly, like beauty and taste as a way to communicate exclusivity visually, like a signal. Um, Yeah, so I think before getting into like the actual analysis of Gallerinas, I want to talk about like the historical context surrounding it. And let's start with like Larry Gagosian, the guy that we were just talking about, who's kind of this titan of the art landscape that the Gallerinas kind of peak is at. So Larry Gagosian, he's from LA, he's Armenian American, working class. He gets a degree from UCLA in English Lit, and he works his way up in the 70s from selling posters to selling art. And by the early 1980s, Gagosian in the art world has a reputation for leaning super heavily into the secondary art market, which is basically like buying and reselling art rapidly and benefiting from seller commissions each time. So obviously, you can imagine money would rack up pretty quickly. And he was so good at this that he earns the nickname Gogo, which he famously did not like. But I think it's probably because it's more revelatory of the truth than it is defamatory. Anyways, like in the 80s, he develops these close relationships with prolific and really modern contemporary artists like Jean Michel Basquiat, Andy Warhol, and after their tragic deaths in the 80s, Gagosian was kind of the person to flood the market with a lot of their pieces. They were known as like super prolific artists, and he made a lot of money off of it. And something that was also kind of happening at the time was this thing where dealers would appraise other dealers' work, and that would kind of legitimize their high price points. And the more that this would happen as time went on, the more money was kind of circulating in the art market itself. So much that by the early 1990s, the art market was kind of seen as legitimate a form of investment as stocks. Like people would buy paintings as an asset. And especially in the landscape of the 1990s, where a lot of, you know, wealth boom is happening in general, like in places like Japan, for example, there starts to emerge like a real, um, like a larger amount of clientele and the art market as commerce, I think, rather than like the art world, just art for art's sake, is really starting to become kind of coherent and crystallized. Yeah. And Gagosian is kind of like at the forefront of this, and he's kind of known for that stuff. In the case of like Basquiat and Warhol, because they were so prolific, because they had so much work, um, Gagosian was kind of the man for selling these things because precisely he was known for like mass amounts of art and like selling things at a very fast pace and just like this urgency with the art market. Like in the book that I was reading, there actually is a quote that says that at one point he sold and resold the same painting 3 times in one day. So, things are really proliferating at a rapid speed and the market is becoming bigger and bigger. Um, yeah, so besides the market, like something that Gagosian was also known for, obviously we can tell from the Basquiat and Warhol piece, is that he's also the guy to sell these contemporary and super novel artists and artist movements. So his galleries become known for artists in the schools of abstract expressionism and pop art. So alongside ambition, there's also this piece about like coolness and novelty. So it's not just about the commerce, but also about like a certain image, portraying a certain image. And I think it's important to talk about this because I think it kind of illustrates the context that Gallerinas are coming from. Anyways, like at this point, like we're moving, let's like move to New York. So in the 80s, when Gagosian's kind of getting started, like most of the galleries at this point were in Soho, which was previously an industrial kind of place. But with the art money boom and the legitimization of the district itself by like the city government, the neighborhood begins to attract like a lot more tourists and developers. And obviously, like prices go up, people get driven out. A lot of these galleries begin getting replaced with like retail and housing kind of districts. And there's this like pivotal point in the early 90s where artists begin looking at Chelsea, which at this point was south of the meatpacking district. If you remember, like in Sex and the City, like Samantha's moving around this area and it's trendy but kind of seedy, with like warehouses and like sex workers and leather bars. Anyways, they kind of look at this place as one like where you can get like the most bang for your buck in terms of real estate. Um, And real estate is really important at the time because art becomes a lot more conceptual. There's things like large installations and video art, and there's kind of a real need for larger galleries in general. But two, like artists are also interested in this in terms of like exclusivity. I think a lot of them um were becoming like frustrated with like the touristy kind of overpopulated art scene, and the idea of moving somewhere like Chelsea was that because it was in kind of this area that would inherently filter out certain groups of people, they could capture more of the people that they wanted, right? There would be more of an exclusivity and like a coolness factor. Um, so yeah, I think all this to say is that like commerce and image are kind of both intertwined with each other and kind of inform the decisions of people, of the players in this world at the time. Anyway, so a lot of people moved to Chelsea. It's cool, it's trendy, and things boom. So by 2007, there's over 350 galleries on this stretch between 10th Avenue and Hudson River, spanning half a mile. So in half a mile, there's over 300 galleries. And Gagosian himself gets 2 galleries in Chelsea. Um, and like Chelsea becomes like the scene of this art market boom. Like it begins to have like a real place that people can land, especially like international clientele. They make their pilgrimages to New York, and a lot of these things are happening in Chelsea. Um, and it emerges as the place to buy cool, valuable art. Um, so what do gallerinas configure in all of this? So gallery girls or young female attendants, like I said, have been kind of a thing in the art world for several decades prior to that point. But with this new kind of like art industry turned market, this like blend of art and commerce, the role of the gallery girl becomes more specific than just like attending to guests or attending to paintings. She becomes like art and commerce embodied. Um, she becomes like this ornament signifying like beauty and tastes that drives people to buy work. In the book Boom, Mad Money, Mega Dealers, and the Rise of Contemporary Art, there's this quote by one of the power players that kind of describes the specific role of the gallerina in this like booming landscape. So I'll read it. Art market lawyer Aaron Richard Golub, who had started as a social acquaintance of Gagosian's and ended up fighting him in court, attended a number of those parties and appreciated the dynamic involved. The guests, he noted, were nearly all male and, of course, quite wealthy. Scattered among them were Gagosian's growing number of salespeople, most of them young women. Pretty girls sell those paintings, Golub averred, all between 19 and 25. That was perhaps stretching it, but the women, Golub insisted, were of a type. All about 5'6", never good looking enough to be models, but great as salespeople. Okay, like obviously he puts it in a much more crude way, than what's being implied here, but yeah, like I think it kind of illustrates the aesthetic role that gallerinas are playing, not just in the image of the gallery, but like in selling the art itself, right? And I think this quote helps us land at the kind of cultural theory that is foregrounding this entire analysis of the gallerina, which is aesthetic labor. And aesthetic labor is coined by Ashley Mears, I think. And I'm going to be reading a quote from her article called Aesthetic Labor for the Sociologies of Work, Gender, and Beauty. So, the first quote, just defining aesthetic labor, is it's the practice of hiring employees on the basis of their looks. While similar to the classic concept of emotional labor, aesthetic labor foregrounds embodiment, thus moving beyond an analytic focus on feelings to reveal how the worker corporeality is appropriated and transmuted for commercial benefit. Um, so, one piece here is differentiating aesthetic labor from emotional labor and talking about how it's situated in like the physical presence and presentation of the person itself rather than like the service work that she might provide. Another quote, which complicates or adds complexity to the idea of aesthetic labor, is the concept situates Bourdieu's whatever embodied cultural capital in observable practices and on-the-job interactions, thus opening up the black box of beauty to show how evaluations of bodies are constructed within organizational and market contexts. Okay, so walk with me here as we unpack this. Mears does a pretty good job of like applying this to the Abercrombie phenomenon of hiring workers. So the example goes like one, good looking people sell clothes, right? But two, most importantly, like evaluations of what constitutes good looking are constructed under the market contexts. So if you're an aspirational prep brand and consumers' buy-in is dictated by their desire to be a part of this aspirational prep vibe, you're working within that paradigm of beauty. So this interplay between like consumer market and beauty is what the author is getting at, right? That they're like intertwined with each other and they inform each other. Um like in some ways it's what they're selling. Um yeah, I think there's that. And then I think the second part is embodied cultural capital is the fact that it's not just about looking a certain way, but it's about what the way you look like what the way you look like signals. And in the case of the Gallerina, because we're working under this landscape of like art and taste and things like that, what she how she self presents also has to like signal those things. So like beauty in and of itself is not enough. There's also like beauty as a visual signal of a certain kind of intellectual knowledge about art or classics or things like that. Um, how taste shows up in presentation, right? And that's pretty obvious. Like there's all these things like quiet luxury that kind of talks about how social status and knowledge and stuff is communicated in what you wear and how you present yourself. Yeah, so I think this is pretty interesting to talk about in terms of the Gallerina, because it's kind of both. She's both ornament and uh, utility in some ways. Um, yeah, like I think this kind of brings us to our analysis of like the most famous Gallerina, which would be Charlotte York. And let's talk about her in terms of like what her beauty says about the social values of like the place she's working in. So she's obviously a brunette, which is probably an important piece. She has these soft, refined features. She's prim, but she's open. Um, she wears like tasteful designer, intellectual designer. I think of like the scene where she's interacting with this like fleet of lesbian like art buyers and they compliment her Prada loafers. Like Prada's like the perfect brand for this kind of Gallerina vibe. Anyways, other things like embodied cultural capital, like how what this presentation says about her. Um, she's from Connecticut. She's waspy. She went to Smith, a liberal arts school, and she has a degree in art history. Um, so yeah, like these are the things that are valued in the art world space. So like I was talking about like physical appearance, but this kind of weight and intellectualism, that is kind of contrasted maybe to like how a person of aesthetic labor might operate in different spaces, like an Abercrombie or American Apparel or certain modeling or nightclub or etc. Um, yeah, like I also want to like talk about Charlotte's beauty and her position as a Gallerina in contrast with the other Sex and the City girls. I was reading this article called A Brief Survey of Gallerinas in Pop Culture, and I think it illustrates it pretty well. The gallery girl plays an important function in the realm of female gendered media, or female geared media, as a sort of counterbalance to the manic pixie dream girl. While both are creative, the Gallerina is as focused and ambitious as the manic pixie dream girl is whimsical and carefree. I think the obvious analogy here is like Charlotte Gallery or Charlotte Gallerina girl versus Carrie, like manic pixie dream girl in some senses. Um and I think it's also kind of apparent in like what they do. Like Carrie is the writer, so she is in some ways like the quote unquote talent, and like the value that she has is like in the work that she produces, versus Charlotte is someone like who mediates that work, or who manages that work, or who's like the kind of middle person between the work and the buyer, right? um I think another piece here is that like Charlotte's more like grounded beauty and more grounded self-presentation kind of talks about like what the Gallerina's values are, which is that like she's more ambitious, she's more focused, maybe more career oriented in some ways. But an important piece is that like the commercialism aspect is part of the whole package. Like she's interested in the art market. Like she's not necessarily interested in being an artist or in representing, I don't know, like indie artists or something like that. Like she has more buy-in to the world of like commerce and stuff than like maybe other kinds of aesthetic labor situated girls might be. And yeah, I think that's important to note that like she has more buy-in and she's probably like more culturally mainstream in some ways. Uh and she's not as like unengaged or maybe jaded, but also not like oblivious as like a Miranda or a Carrie, right? Um, Another contrast that I think is interesting in this vein is Marnie Michaels from Girls with Sujin. If you guys remember, like there's a scene where Marnie runs into Sujin, and Sujin, who is the previous assistant of this artist that Marnie was hooking up with, talks about how she's opening a gallery. And Marnie, who has some experience as a gallery girl, kind of posits herself in this superior way that Marnie often does and says, like, oh, like I feel like I can lend you some knowledge and know how because it seems like galleries are opening and closing every day in Bushwick. And then Sujin kind of counteracts that and is like, oh no, like the gallery's actually in Soho. Um, and in that moment, like we see exactly how lost and floaty Marnie is because we realize that like Sujin's gallery has a lot of legitimacy by being in Manhattan and by being in Soho over like Brooklyn, right? Um, and also like we see how Sujin is preoccupied with like commercialism. Like the aim is to sell art. Like she even says that she's gonna portray herself as younger, um, in order to like sell more art. Like she's pretty aware of like aesthetic labor as a means to selling things, and she's totally buying into it. Like she's cool with it. Whereas Marnie is like just completely more unprofessional and lost and kind of just like ambiguous, I guess I would say. Um, yeah, I think like in some ways like Sujin might be the more legitimate Gallerina, according to this Charlotte Yorkian analysis or whatever. Um, yeah, like to talk a little bit more about like the Brooklyn Manhattan divide. I was watching Gallery Girls, this like random reality show on like Bravo or something. I don't know. Um, it's like really housewives vibes, so like not really relevant, but there's this contrast between like Brooklyn and Manhattan as like this place of like more seriousness and buy-in versus Brooklyn as like more whimsy and countercultural vibes or whatever. Anyways, like Manhattan is important. But yeah, like to go back to Charlotte York and like her willingness or like her awareness of like her role as like aesthetic labor, and her willingness to like I don't know if it's like exploit it or like use it to the ends of like making a sale, which is like the ultimate goal. There's a couple examples of this in the series. I think most notably it's in season 1 episode 5 called The Power of Female Sex, where Charlotte is she journeys to like this male artist's like compound, I guess, in the role of like a gallery person, and his whole thing is like very Georgia O'Keeffe vibes. Like he just paints like that area down under. I don't know what I can say or what I can't say. He paints that, and then he offers or like he offers Charlotte to pose for him or whatever, or he invites her to pose for him. And Charlotte, like being Charlotte, like she's obviously uncomfortable, right? But eventually she acquiesces to the kind of muse position in order to make the sale. So here, like in the interaction between herself and the artist dude, like it's clear that her value is more so in like the aesthetic inspiration and like the muse kind of vibes that she brings, more so in her utility as like a logistics gallery salesperson, right? But she's willing to do it because she really values this artist and she thinks like his work would obviously sell very well and it would be like a great asset to have his work at the gallery or something like that, right? Um, and I think it's pretty interesting because it shows that like Charlotte is willing to kind of play the part, so to speak, of this like aesthetic labor in order to fulfill the thing that she's concerned with, which is making the sale. So yeah, I guess this awareness piece is also there with Gallerinas. Like they kind of know what the deal is. Yeah, but another instance where this kind of shows up is in season 3. There's this episode where Charlotte again is interacting with a male artist and he offers her to pose as like a drag king, and Again, like she's uncomfortable with the initial proposition, but eventually acquiesces to it. At the end of the day, it turns into a good sell opportunity for her, and it all works out. Obviously, the way that the series portrays it isn't like, oh, like Charlotte is willing to play the part for her career ambitions. It's more so like, um, she kind of uses it as an like it's kind of an opportunity for Charlotte to open up. So, the dynamic between like the man and the woman or like the gallerina and the artist or whatever is not like it's like not really explicitly endorsed or anything, but it's a pretty interesting read, I think, given like all that we're talking about when it comes to aesthetic labor. Um and I think what's interesting about like Charlotte's trajectory is that what someone might think of as like the gallerina part, which is like a stepping stone to like a higher position in the art world, like to be a curator or like the head of a gallery or have your own gallery or whatever. Instead of like using it as a stepping stone, Charlotte kind of settles into the aesthetic laborial role. I think this is most apparent in like her marriage with Trey, which is obviously about like status and image and like how good they look as a couple. And Charlotte's quote unquote like success in being a good partner for Trey is obviously in the way that she looks, but also in like what the way that she looks signals. Like the beauty wouldn't mean anything if it didn't signal her waspiness, her like knowledge, her class, her da 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 da. Like these are the things that like Trey's world values. And this is what Charlotte is bringing to the table. Um, so like in the marriage, she kind of settles into the aesthetic role and never really kind of, I guess, ascends, I would say, like the gallerina position. Um, and even though like there's the piece where she kind of realizes that the status isn't worth it, and then she moves on to like a much more grounded and fulfilling relationship with Harry. Like we never really see the rest of Charlotte's career ascendancy or like the role that um the gallerina position could play in her career ascendancy throughout the rest of the series. There's like a small piece in and just like that where she returns to the gallery, and I think like gallerina is even like explicitly named as a term in this episode, but she goes to put on a dress and the dress is too tight and she's frustrated because she feels like looks are still a big part of this role, only to go to the gallery and like realize it's a very diverse set of women, and like the kind of scene that she feels like she needs to play the role of has like already passed. Like that whole gallerina scene is way behind her and it's the 2020s now. Anyways, like I think that's kind of the only other point in the series where like these kind of concerns of aesthetic labor show up, because otherwise she's a wife and mother primarily and then a friend. um but yeah, I think what's interesting though is that like for like in terms of like perception and what people like about Charlotte, this kind of is it, right? It's not about her career woman like girl boss stuff like a Miranda or a Samantha. It's precisely about like settling into this role. Like that's kind of what's appealing about her in some ways. Um and I think like this brings us to what makes the gallerina compelling, which I guess would be like the aspirationalness. Uh, this is probably like Sex and the City in general. Obviously, it's coming from like a nostalgia for this, for like having a place in this cultural industry that no longer is a thing. So like Samantha PR, carrying magazines and writing, Charlotte galleries. Um, but more so, I think it would be the fantasy of playing this role of aesthetic labor gallerina girl forever, and it being like a way to break into like this kind of society or whatever. um I think probably the parallel that we might see this most in is in Alexandra Leclerc, like I was talking about, the new wife of Charles Leclerc, F1 driver. And Alexandra comes from this like art background. She was studying it. She was working for some galleries at some point, I believe. And she drops out of college to become a wag, essentially wife and girlfriend, and to follow her lover around the world as he races or whatever. And people really like Alexandra, because of this, in spite of this, I don't know, but like there's something about like both of these, like the whole thing, like not just her beauty and not just her style, but also like her knowledge and her classiness, I guess people might say, her chicness that like is really appealing to people, right? And like the fact that it's in relation to like a more famous man makes it all the more interesting. And I talk about her explicitly, not because she's like kind of popping off right now, but also because she literally wrote a piece about Gallerinas in March, like a couple weeks ago, and in Australian Vogue, and she talks in the piece about like the ties between Gallerinas and fashion. So she cites like Peggy Guggenheim's relationship to Schiaparelli, which is not even relevant. Like Peggy was a art collector. She wasn't like a art peddler, but whatever. Um Another thing that's funny is that like a lot of people think it's written by AI and it's just kind of cringe, but like writing questionable writing aside, I think the article is pretty interesting because it shows the prominent fantasy of the gallerina as like a source of inspiration for designers. Like, how cool is it that your demeanor and your fashion is like so generative, like in fashion and like these social circles, and high society and stuff like that. I think like the piece kind of makes explicit those ties, and also just like the life that she's living herself, kind of makes explicit those ties, um, that are like so compelling. Point being, like part of the fantasy is like the aesthetic labor itself, like that in itself is glamorous, and that in itself is like cool or whatever. Um, yeah, let's see. Yeah, like another kind of part of the piece is that she writes about, I guess, the other gallerina du jour right now, which is Phyllis Cow, who is the like auctioneer person. I don't know if it's for Sotheby's or Christie's, but some like very commercial art house. And part of Phyllis's appeal, more so in the utility that she has as like an art middle person, is just in the way that she dresses and the way that she carries herself. Like that's the kind of the point of her vibe. And yeah, I think like people's attraction to her and like projections onto her have to do with like what she like embodies being so generative and like inspirational and cool, rather than necessarily like the utility that she has. um but again, at the same time, like taste being a big part of this, it's not just about like what she looks, but like about how like what like how she presents herself and what that says about like her intellect or whatever. um like no one wants to be typecast as just like a pretty wag, but like a pretty smart wag who is smart about fashion and is smart about art, and those things show up in the way she dresses is much more like compelling and I guess serviceable for like this kind of new girl who's concerned with these things. Anyways, to kind of continue on the aspirational gallery girl front, we have this like October 2011 Vogue spread titled Gagosians, which is like the feminized version of Gagosian. Gagosian? Oh my god, whatever. And the spread features top female staff of the Gagosian galleries, and they're in these like couture dresses, like really like decked out, super cool. Um, and they're kind of like the embodiment of this other part of it, which is the career fantasy about like how like the aesthetic labor part ended up working out for them. Like they were able to ascend into like this career powerhouse role. And they still look like cool while doing it. And I think like the way that these two are tied is pretty evident in like the article's writing itself. So there's this quote called, "To be a Gagosian, you have to be ambitious, intelligent, well-connected, socially adept, highly discreet, reachable at all times, stress resistant, and mad about art. It also helps if you speak several languages and know how to dress well. And it doesn't hurt to be beautiful and come from an aristocratic family." Okay, so the first part is just like skills, right? The second part is about knowledge, sartorial sense, beauty, and class. Many things that people are usually just born into. Like people, if you have access to it, you have access to it, and if you don't, you don't. Um, and I think what's interesting is that like even though these are women who have supposedly outgrown the gallerina life, like they're no longer necessarily like these attendants or demoted titles, either from being promoted or from being older or whatever, the last line still kind of indicates the implicit function of these women, which is like part of their function is like to project a certain image. And on top of that, I think it also kind of illustrates the, like we were talking about, like the certain kind of beauty that's prized, that's inherently unattainable. Kind of rupturing this fantasy that we might have about aspiration. It's just um they're usually from these backgrounds where they're already rich and they already have access to knowledge to know about certain artworks and go to college and things like that. Um, and it's kind of just like inherent rather than a product of, like a hustler mentality or whatever. The article also cites the kind of more unsavory aspects about Larry Gagosian. Um, when he's asked about like why he's given this factoid about like how the galleries employ 2 times more women than men, he kind of like laughs it off and is like, "Oh, like I didn't know that." And then he goes on and talks about how like the only problem he has with women as employees is that they take maternity leave. Um, and then also laughs that off and stuff. Um, but I think that's pretty revelatory about his attitude towards women and female employees as a whole, to be honest. The article also cites like his turbulent outbursts and like his crazy expectations. And I think this kind of like reminds me of other examples of aesthetic labor at work, in like Abercrombie and American Apparel with like Dove Charney, and like how they're headed by these like generous, charming, knowledgeable, but also like volatile, borderline abusive, extremely demanding men. And how a lot of people, through being positioned in this aesthetic laborial role, have indeed gotten opportunities. Like some have become models or influencers or creative directors or curators, salespeople, etc., art dealers. Even though like what they were rendered into by these men gave them opportunities, like at the end of the day, like power still belongs to them. Like they're still the ones who dictate the terms, they're still the ones whose expectations others have to live up to, and they're still the ones who have the power, I guess, to like be borderline abusive. So when I think about the article, I just think about how like it dispels the whole fantasy of like the ascendance of an, like the kind of Cinderella story or whatever of the Gallerina that people might project onto her. Um, on one front, it being like classed and racialized already, but on the second hand, that the labor itself is inherently kind of demeaning or whatever, or degrading. Yeah, like rupturing the fantasy. Yeah, I think I want to talk about like probably what's the most well-known example of quote unquote like the depraved ballerina, which would be in the book My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Tessa Moshfegh. And the novel, you probably already know, but the novel takes place at the turn of the century, and it's about this unnamed protagonist who is a gallerina of sorts at a Chelsea gallery. And she's thin, she's blonde, she's beautiful, she's rich, she's well dressed, she has an art history degree from Columbia, and the book chronicles her using like a fleet of prescription medication to kind of sleep all day and basically have this temporary retreat from life itself. Um, I know Tessa is known for this, but as the retreat goes on, like the grossness of the whole ordeal becomes more apparent. So the protagonist, she's not brushing her teeth, she's drooling all over the place, like her apartment is a mess, there's food rotting, her clothes are stained, her bed sheets are stained, and the grossness coming to the surface is kind of like just a literal symbol of what was kind of there all along in the character, like obviously like a deep depression, but also this feeling of like passivity in your own life. I'm thinking of like depression rooms and stuff like that, and like the act of letting your leftovers rot around you because you just simply can't conjure up the energy or the agency to get rid of it, and like the grossness being like a result of fully like giving into that passivity. And even though the character isn't like technically a gallerina for much time in the book, I think it's still relevant for like this analysis about like the underbelly of the Gallerina archetype and like aesthetic labor at large. Like kind of like as time goes on, we see more and more like the grossness coming to surface, and like the passivity of like being in this role, and acquiescing to like I guess the whims of other people. Uh, yeah, like I was thinking about Otessa's book a lot in relation to like this piece literally called Gallerina by Beatrice Bonino. It's like an installation, and Bonino's work uses a lot of like preservation materials that have been neglected and aged. So things like bubble wrap, plastic, vinyl, paper, things like that. Like when you think of like when you buy like a iPhone case that's like clear plastic and then it ages over time and it becomes yellow and gross and opaque. And then like in that moment you kind of recognize what was once like clean and pristine, like you now see it for what it is, which is like artificial and cheap or whatever, like through the aging process. Anyways, like the work is this kind of mattress-ish made of like plastic and vinyl and like similar materials, and it's displayed on the floor, and it has like this weird like clinical like delicate opaque like cloudy murky vibe. um yeah, and it reminds you of like grossness coming to surface with neglect, right? And something about the work that Brioni Dawson talks about is like in this delicate rendering, like the process of folding, like a lot of folding is involved in like making the piece. And they compare it to Deleuze's like oh my god, I'm doing so bad with my French philosopher pronunciations. Anyways, like his concept of the fold, and about the fold, he says, Deleuze, for the fold announces that the inside is nothing more than a fold of the outside. So let me repeat that. Like, for the fold announces that the inside is nothing more than a fold from the outside. So inside, outside, whatever. Meaning that what we might think of as like a very stark delineation between like exteriority and interiority is actually the same thing. Like it's all part of the same package. And obviously, like this is pretty analogous to Gallerinas. That's why the work is titled Gallerina. And Dawson says decoration and utility are folded into one another. Like they're the same thing, like I was saying. They're inextricable. Like one can't exist without the other. Like if she's just a pretty face, she can't just be a pretty face for the gallery. She also has to have like this kind of signal taste in order for it to like make any sense in terms of the image you want to project of the gallery. Um, yeah, decor and utility. And later in the writing, Dawson brings up this other definition of fold, which means like to give in, to acquiesce. And for me, like we're just talking about this with like My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Like the protagonist kind of gives in to her lack of agency and just like fully becomes a passive being. And all of this kind of traverses on a mattress. So um I'm making this analysis like in real time, guys. Like I just realized that like most of the book takes place on a mattress, and then this piece called Gallerina is literally also kind of a mattress. Anyways, um, I think the commentary here is like when it comes to the mattress piece is also about like passivity and lack of agency and giving in and folding, in the sense of a young Gallerina as a sex object. I think that doesn't really need explaining. Like it was made pretty literal, actually, in like the other quote we were talking about Gallerinas at these parties and stuff. Um, and there's like weird undertones surrounding it with like some of the Charlotte pieces. Anyways, yeah. And like what both the book and the piece do is like they take this concept of like Gallerina acquiescence and they show, like they make literal how gross and depraved and like cheap and artificial it feels. um One through like the excrements of the body in the book, and then in the piece through like the aging and neglected like weird materials. Yeah, like I think like these are kind of two sides of the same coin in terms of like this kind of depraved function of the Gallerina. um And I think in terms of the book, it was obviously like a huge hit. And I think the reaction to the character kind of shows how people are recognizing what Otessa is putting down. Um, they have like a nuanced understanding of like the kind of femininity at play. Obviously, some people like dismiss it as like rich girl problems, whatever. But there's like a real like recognition of the grossness kind of undercurrent in feminine performance or being cast in a certain feminine role. And I think what makes it more complicated is that there's like a tiny part of people that find it appealing. I think that's also part of the popularity of the book. Like, there's a tiny part of you that is attracted to this like troubled, uh, depraved glamour. And I think it's a pretty apt definition of like the complex femininity that people are most attracted to today. I think another pretty timely example of this would be in like the popularity of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy and how like obviously like she's kind of Gallerina adjacent, like she's part of the same like late 90s New York milieu. She's part of like a creative industry job. But again, like I'm saying, like I think the attraction to her is that the glamour is undergirded by like tragedy, one, but also like depravity, like whether or not she had a drug problem, I don't know. But I think like would she have been so compelling in an enduring way if that push and pull didn't exist? Like if the Issei Miyake wasn't like foregrounded with tragedy and exploitation and turbulence on account of being a woman. I don't think it would. Um, so like I think even though the gallerina as a term isn't really deployed today, like there's not really like I was looking for gallerinas on TikTok and I literally only saw one girl posting about herself as a self-described gallerina. Anyways, like even though it's like not a deployed archetype today in the way that like a magazine girl or like a glam girl, which is girls in like libraries, archives, and museums, any totally different thing. Anyways, like its sensibility still shows up today. Uh again in like this attraction to glamour and objection or passivity or whatever. It still informs a lot of things, even beyond like the whole sartorial influence on the runway or whatever. I think it just kind of encapsulates like the kind of feminine that we're attracted to overall. And I think that's like my ultimate aim for the program in general is to kind of grasp onto these things and wade both into like the glamour and the objection and not like narrativize each one. Like I don't want it to be um but like I think I'm coming back to like Charlotte York in that like I'm not endorsing her or putting her down either way. Like I think I understand her enduring glamour. I also think it's weird. It's just a whole matrix of emotions. Um, and that's what I kind of want to tackle in like the program. Um, yeah, I think that like version of femininity feels pretty resonant to me. I think in an age where like knowing the social undercurrents of certain things and doing it anyway is like how most women practice femininity. It's like Gen Z girls like putting on makeup even if they're smart enough to know like feminist theory about like or anti-capitalist theory, blah blah blah, but like still doing it anyway. I think that's like kind of the state of femininity right now, at least for like my peers. And it's what I'm attracted to, and I think it's what Gallerinas kind of embody. Anyways, thank you for listening to Dear Americana. I have links to all my sources below, and I invite you to please continue the convo in the comments. Or suggest any other archetypes that you think are worth looking into. I think something I'm exploring right now is like the Oregon Trail and like the founding, like the first Mormon wives and their whole role in like Mormon femininity today. I don't know, but like suggest anything that you think might be cool. And I hope you enjoyed. And I'll see you next time. Bye.